This week, April battery innovation brings May fossil fuel tears. There has been so much battery innovation and progress this month that big oil CEOs are set to receive more pain than when I stepped on that Lego a few days ago, Brian. I mean, my kids are 16 and 20. Why am I still stepping on Lego? Doesn't make any sense.
The U.S. has plans to upgrade 100,000 miles of power transmission lines in the next 5 years. This is not unlike the 20th century push for the interstate highway system, but without the smelly rest stops.
U.S. President Joe Biden, who claims to be alive, announced sweeping new regulations for coal plants that will likely cause them to close sooner than expected. Even Santa Claus is no longer allowed to put coal in stockings. Brian, you'll be glad to hear that.
Yes, sir. And that is right, James. The state of Nevada has already put a large grid storage battery on a site that used to house a coal power plant. And in true Nevada fashion, the batteries will be charged by pull handles on slot machines.
All that and more on this edition of the Clean Energy Show. And also this week, carbon capture and sequestration is greenwashing. Stanford University professor Mark Jacobson is going to tell us why Gogoro scooter batteries are finding second life uses and adding revenue to the already hugely successful e-mobility company. EVs are already proven to be more environmental than combustion cars, but when you recycle the batteries, when you factor that in, Brian, while the payback period greatly drops by years, and it can be as little as 1 year of driving before you are more environmental than a gas or diesel car. Honda will invest billions alongside two Canadian governments to build EVs, the first of which will roll off the assembly line in the futuristic year 2028. And G7 countries discuss 2035 as an end date for coal-fired generation. And we have even more than everything I've mentioned. A very, very busy week, Brian.
Yes, and I feel great. I feel like a new man because I finally cleared my podcast playlist.
Wow, an accomplishment for a retired man.
Yes. So I love podcasts, but I tend to subscribe to too many, so I can't listen to all the episodes. So you get up with this huge backlog of podcasts, and this had been going on for months. And through a combination of just listening to a lot of podcasts and then just deleting a bunch and cutting back on my subscriptions, for the first time in probably 2 or 3 years, I've cleared my podcast playlist. So only new episodes I listen to, and it's a great feeling.
Well,
I feel
now you have time to listen to our show. You could maybe squeeze in one of our episodes. It's very good.
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but I think more audiobooks is the plan. Fewer podcasts, more audiobooks.
Interesting. You should mention that because I'm going to talk about that in a second.
Oh, okay.
But go on.
And just a quick update on Gasoline Alley, the daily newspaper comic strip. I mentioned it a while ago. There was a town vote, and they decided not to change the town to Electric Acres. It's going to remain Gasoline Alley on the longest-running comic strip in existence.
Well, you had to see that coming because, you're not going to change the name of it's the name of the comic, really. So
yeah,
that wouldn't make any sense. It'll just be more quaint as time goes along. Brian, we have new merchandise in the Clean Energy store, linked in your show notes.
Wow.
They now have trucker hats available and mugs and camping mugs. And for limited time only, get $5 off, $5 US off almost every item in our store by using the promo code SUNSHINE. That's Sunshine. Look for it in your show notes, all capital letters for a limited time, everything. And if you have any requests for merchandise, because they have basically almost anything you can imagine and quite a few things you can't, that seem ridiculous. But if you have any items that you thought we should have, we'll put that in the store and they'll print them as you order them with our logo. And it's my son. He's in Vancouver. He's got some time between the end of university and the start of his summer job with the city here in our city. And he is spending a couple weeks on the west coast of Canada, and he's sending me pictures of things that are foreign to me, like bike garages and bike paths, well-made, isolated bike paths. And it's a different world, BC. I mean, every car you look, you can't swing a cat without hitting an electric car. And he's staying in hostels and, It's a very progressive place.
Yeah, and we're used to seeing things like, bike garages in Europe, but they're not so common in North America, and I didn't know they even existed here in Canada. But yeah,
Pretty
course,
cool.
in BC,
Pretty
that
cool.
makes
He
sense,
rented
yeah.
a bike. He stayed in hostels and he rented a bicycle for a while for Vancouver. Then today he went to Victoria on, without a vehicle as a pedestrian, and he's going to rent a car on Vancouver Island and go to Tofino and do stuff like that because he's only 20 and apparently there's regulations. It's difficult to rent a car at that age, but I think Hertz has a special program that I found for him. Yeah, I don't know if he'll rent electric or not. He should, because I scoped it out for my own purposes, and there was lots of chargers around and not a problem. And speaking of books, I've been trying to read Mark Jacobson's book, No Miracles Needed, and it's very expensive. I don't know why, if it's just a demand thing or something like that, but I think there's, it's like $80 or something. And I don't even think that's a hardcover. So it wasn't possible that I was going to get it anytime soon. So I went to the library, and my partner is the library person. She has several library branches named after her for all her late fees that built them. And she very much is a library person. She's constantly reading. She has Libby apps and everything you can imagine. So she set me up, and it was there. The book was there as an audiobook, only as an audiobook, and then it was gone. There was no reference to it the next day by the time I actually signed up and got my library account reinstated and dusted it off the mothballs that it was in, and it was just gone. I can't explain it.
Yeah, that's weird, but it can be slightly confusing. And yeah, I'm a big fan of the public library for stuff like audiobooks. I think a lot of people still don't realize that you can get things like audiobooks. Sometimes you have to wait if it's popular, waiting list. But there can be different apps, and that's the confusing part. So our library uses Libby, but they used to use this Overdrive, or Overdrive changed to Libby. So there's sometimes more than one way to access the collection at your local library.
Hoopla too is another one.
Yeah, Hoopla. So it could be something to do with that. So maybe check Hoopla or check another app.
I did.
There's probably it's available somewhere.
I did, but I'll keep looking. So his book is very interesting. It's called No Miracles Needed. Basically, it's in line with what this show is about, that we only need renewable energy and very little else to complete the energy transition. And he outlines how that is. He is a Stanford University professor in engineering and environmental engineering. So carbon capture and storage, we have one of those plants. And when the Australian group mocked carbon capture and storage, they outlined in our small Canadian province here our carbon capture and storage, which has been going for, is it upwards of 20 years already?
No.
It's been started about 20 years ago, though, and funded.
They started talking about it that long ago, but it's only been operational for 5 or 6, I think.
I think it's a bit more than that, Brian, because I was reading reports about the first 5 years of it in 2016 or something like that when I was doing some
closer
research.
To 10 then.
Yeah, time does fly, and we talked last week about a family of farmers saying that carbon was coming out of their ground by where they were pumping it in. And it's by climate scientists and the people who are doing the hard work of the energy transition, the policy and the analysis that are advising governments really don't like carbon capture and storage. And the oil industry and the fossil fuel industry in general thinks that it is, or tries to say that it's the solution so that we can burn and use more of our product. But their product is already not competitive with renewables, and then you add the added cost of the storage of which you can't even capture. Like, I think ours is captured 40 or 50%. It has a lot of downtime. It hasn't been working. It never works. It's supposed to capture 90%, but it has not ever for one day ever done that. Not even for one day. So this is often used for coal, but they want to use it for natural gas. They want to use it for other things. The CO2 is transported into a pipeline and stored deep underground in geological formations. And it's often used, as it is here where we live, to pump more oil out of the ground. It combines with the oil and makes it less dense and brings it to the surface. Not only does it cost a lot, but, it's just there's environmental issues. So Mark Jacobson, I have a clip when he would talk to Robert Llewellyn about a year ago or so on carbon capture and storage. This is 1 minute and 40 seconds, and I want you to listen to it because he's talking about a carbon capture and storage facility in Texas, and he says that greenwashing is all that this is.
But just to give you an idea how ridiculous this is. So they put carbon capture equipment on a coal plant, on part of a coal plant, to try to capture the emissions from part of this coal plant. But they built a natural gas plant just to provide the electricity to run the equipment for the coal plant, the carbon capture in the coal plant. I mean, how insane is that? They didn't capture any of the carbon from the natural gas plant. They just burned the natural gas, and that CO2 went to the air. They weren't counting for that. Then they had to go mine for the gas, and they had to dig more mines. And then they transport it. So on average, it's like 3.5% of the methane from that natural gas well and the piping and the processing, leaks to the air. And then they don't capture all the carbon from the coal plant because the carbon capture equipment is not as efficient as when it's running perfectly. It has a certain efficiency that might be 90% or 92% or something. But first of all, it doesn't run all year, and because it's for maintenance and not only for maintenance, but sometimes because the CO2 where was it being piped? They then built some pipes for the CO2 and sent it to a nearby oil field to bind with the oil. The CO2 would bind with the oil to make it less dense so it would come to the surface faster so they can actually extract more oil. Well, that process releases 40% of all the CO2 that's captured, goes right back to the air. Nobody accounts for that. But when you actually account for the fact that you're not accounting for any of the CO2 that from the upstream mining of the coal, the transport of the coal, and only a portion of this burned coal CO2 is captured. So when all is said and done, before you even count for what happens to the CO2 after the capture, over a 20-year time frame, the capture rate was about 11%.
Yeah, and we spent $1 billion doing that. $1 billion so that we could keep
I think it was
burning
closer
coal.
to 2, yeah.
It was a lot of billions. It would probably be more billions now. That was 10 years ago or whatever it was. And and then both political parties in our province were behind that. And it's nonsense. It's trying to preserve coal jobs and the resource of coal that we happen to have here. But at what cost? Why not put $2 billion into renewables? I mean, imagine if they'd done that. It would have been 100% clean, except for the manufacturing of the products, which can pay off in a month or 3 months or 6 months.
Yeah, because it can be politically difficult to shut down a whole industry. Now, you'd be creating a whole another industry if you put that money into renewables. But yeah, it's politically difficult to shut it down. And it's politically difficult for governments to only support one path. Governments always like to say they don't like to pick winners and losers, but that means that, you and I have determined solar, wind, and batteries, that's all you need. So that's where the government should be focusing their energy. But then they would be accused of being, politically motivated to support one thing and not another. And I think that's why we still have development of nuclear and carbon capture, because the government's trying to play every angle.
But this is a waste of taxpayer money, ultimately, and that's not good. I mean, why make things worse when you already have to invest money, trillions of dollars worldwide, which, by the way, will pay back in 6 years if we did that right now. It's all it would take, 6 years to pay back, and then it's gravy. Mark Jacobson goes on to say that this is a greenwashing exercise, and it puts the $1 billion of price tags on consumers. And guess what? The poorer you are, the bigger chunk your electricity bill is of your income. And if that has to go up because of BS like this, it's not fair to low-income people.
Yeah, and we have a great story later about how batteries instead of coal are saving money in Nevada.
Okay, this is late-breaking news that I found very discouraging. We'll get the bad news out of the way. Tesla has laid off its new car design team and its supercharging heads and all their teams. So they're not going to develop new cars. Their car fleet is already pretty old. X and S is old, and, car companies revamp their models fairly quickly, and then people buy them. Otherwise, they wouldn't buy them. Current superchargers, Musk says, will be completed and critical superchargers will be added. according to the child man and CEO, betting the farm, I think, on automation now. Things aren't going well for Tesla, so he's saying, I predicted this, that I don't like this, Brian, because this slows the transition. Unless he can pull out a robotaxi out of his butt that can deploy, North America wide at least, if not worldwide, it's going to be a problem and even if he could, it's not going to happen instantly because it's going to be regulation jurisdiction by jurisdiction that's going to have to get approval, and that's going to be slow. It's going to be years. Could be 3 years, could be 2 years in some cases, but more than likely overall it's going to be longer than that. So this is going to happen. And he's slowing down the transition to electric vehicles because he's a crazy man, in my opinion. I think he's screwing current owners, like they just opened up the Supercharger network to, other OEMs, the car companies like GM and Ford and Volkswagen and everyone else, basically, to use their very good network, which also I've seen some stats about how much money it's making them. It's a good revenue source. I mean, if nothing else, maybe he should have sold it, broken it off into a different company and sold it so that somebody can keep deploying those superchargers, keep the Tesla name. It's also good for his company. It's good for the Tesla brand because people have to download the app sometimes, and you get advertising for Teslas on there. But he's definitely switching from a car company to a software company overnight, just saying, that's it, the car thing's not working, let's go to the software and have full self-driving robotaxis everywhere. I'm very skeptical, and I know that you're going to try and defend him now, so go ahead, do your thing.
No defense, but I think it's just a little too early to know for sure what's going on. Tesla tends to move very quickly, so news like this blurts out, and then we tend to get more information about what's going on later. So I just think it's a little bit early. But I will give a plug for the Tesla Daily podcast with Rob Maurer. That was always my favorite source for Tesla news. And he stopped doing it daily, but he put out an episode last week to coincide with the quarterly report. So he's going to keep doing that at least quarterly, possibly monthly if he can manage it. But it's very difficult to get analytical news about Tesla. Everybody tends to report on it emotionally. And that was always the difference with Tesla Daily. He looked at it analytically. So it's difficult to find news sources about Tesla that are analytical rather than emotional.
The CEO does things emotionally.
Oh, yeah. It makes for excellent headlines, and it makes for excellent clickbait. And, people always are going to click on those stories. But I always wished Rob Maurer would kind of franchise his model of doing things, because I would love to have like a Rob Maurer give me all of my news for all of the things I'm interested in, because it would, I would end up with just a much lower blood pressure. So much of the news is so clickbaity that, I don't like it.
No, I mean, CBC in Canada has been running an electric car negative stories so often that I thought, oh, they went a week without publishing one. Then I went there and there was one. And it's almost absurd because the truth is that electric vehicles are doing well. But I know when I go to my wedding this summer and have to face my Alberta relatives, they're all going to say, oh, too bad about Tesla. An electric car's not working out, eh? I'm putting all my money in oil, and they're going to get screwed if anybody is relying on oil. Not only is oil going to go away, and it could go fairly quickly, especially here where it costs more to make the oil, and then the oil that we will use maybe will be from Saudi Arabia, where it's the cheapest to get out of the ground. We're going to have all these facilities to pay for, all these oil wells, these abandoned wells, these abandoned oil refineries. It's going to be a huge, huge, huge burden on my children, and possibly me if I live long enough and start eating my vegetables. So it's not good.
And the question is when. So it's been 4 years now that we've been doing this podcast, and we've been, of course, predicting this since the beginning. And
well, we never really thought it was going to happen. Now I was looking at 2028 as a time for plateauing oil prices.
Yeah, 2030 is kind of what we plan to do the podcast to 2030, because that's when a lot of this stuff will have taken place. But Toyota is still the number one automaker, and they're not interested in EVs. So it's just happening slowly. But hopefully we're right.
Well, let's switch to some good news then. This is from Gogoro. We've talked about them on the show over the years. This is the battery swapping scooter company that is rapidly helping charge the adoption of two-wheeled electrified transport in countries where, and there's a lot of countries where it's the most popular form, 2- and 3-wheelers. We don't often think about that in North America, but there's a lot of places in the world with hundreds and hundreds of millions of people who are using 2- and 3-wheeled transportations, and it's already rapidly transitioning to electric because it makes sense. And the noise and pollution from those vehicles is going way down, and that's important to those larger centers, say in India and Taiwan. So Gogoro is a Taiwanese company that developed a battery swapping refueling platform for urban electric two-wheeled scooters, mopeds, and motorcycles. It also develops its own line of electric scooters. It makes these cool scooters as well as the technology for the swapping of batteries. So it offers its own vehicle innovations to vehicle makers, partners, a lot of them like Hero and Yamaha and many others. Modular batteries, I describe them as like, they remind me of like that when you make bread at home in a bread maker, that
Yeah.
you know,
You
pan,
pull out the bread, yeah.
the pan thing, the metal thing that goes into the bread maker. It's about that size. It's quite heavy and it's got a handle on it. But there's 2 of them in each scooter, and you just plop them in a vending machine at 7-Eleven or somewhere. You stop on the side of the road, take them out, put them in, take fresh ones out. You don't, it knows who you are. Each battery has a serial number in it or something. So
It's about as heavy as the bread that I make if I screw up the recipe.
your pandemic sourdough. So now partnering with a huge investment company, Gogoro is, to expand deployment and ways to monetize their batteries for a second life. Batteries, they go down in the capacity that they have over time. And sometimes at some point you say, well, they're not usable anymore. And it depends on who you are. Battery, like EV makers will say a certain percentage of the original and will replace it under warranty if it goes down below that. Well, I'm guessing around 70% maybe that they would replace these. And what they're using them for, they're finding uses for them before they recycle them. We know that battery recycling is a huge thing now that is just starting to take off and is working very well with 90 to 95% of the minerals recycled. So they're using them for backup power for traffic lights during a power outage. Wouldn't it be nice if our traffic lights worked during power outages, because it's absolute chaos? People around here don't know how to operate.
No one understands how the rules are supposed to work.
It's supposed to work as what we call a 4-way stop here in Canada. And also for parking meters on streets. That's just 2 examples, but they're finding different ways for them. Also, through their what we call battery management, or through the software just on how they charge them and when they charge them and what temperature they're charged at and how fast they're charged, they found out a way. They expected these to only last 10 years, but now they've pushed that to 12 years. So they're getting 20% more out of the batteries. And if you're an investor, that's a big deal when you achieve that, because that's the major cost of what the service they operate. And also these batteries can go into grid storage. I mean, you could build, and some of these vending machines actually work as grid storage. They actually feed the grid and get paid for it in certain locations because there's all this battery power sitting there. And you don't need a full battery to power the grid. You could have all these 70% or even 50% or even 40%. It doesn't matter, because it's not reducing your range on a scooter or an EV. You can put that into a modularly designed item to do that. And then after that is all said and done, and they're, 30% or 25%, then you recycle them and you get all those minerals back and put them in the new batteries, and that makes you a lot of money as well. So that's a good news story to start the show.
Yeah, and you think about not just the Gogoro charging stations, but automobile charging stations. Some of them are starting to have a battery pack with them as well.
I used one in my BC trip last year in the West Coast, because the company didn't have a huge grid connection. This is one where I was getting free power from them because they had plus 20% off their delicious burger restaurant. If you charged, if you dare to charge for free, they would give you 20%. That's just one of the greatest consumer experiences of my life, and I will continue to mention it. And it's called On the Run. And it was great. So
But
they used the
you can see
battery because
where-
they didn't have a huge connection. But when that battery ran out, then you got slow charging, and people were kind of annoyed by that.
But because those Gogoro batteries, because they're already kind of modular, you can see it would be fairly easy to build just a charging station battery where you just plug in a bunch of those Gogoro things. And instead of people pulling them out to use them in their scooters, you just leave them in there. And again, get a few more years out of them before you have to take them apart and recycle them.
Exactly. So it's very interesting business. I wonder if you can invest in them.
Yeah, not sure. All right, from Electric, Nevada has put a big battery energy storage plant where a coal plant used to be. And this is a great use case that we often mention. When you have a coal plant, they already have the grid connections there. So replacing it with clean sources like batteries tends to be fairly easy. So this is in Nevada, NV Energy. This is their largest battery energy storage system. It's going to be 220 megawatts. Versus 557 megawatts from the coal-fired plant. So not as much power as the coal-fired plant because they're only using it 2 hours a day. So the problem they were trying to solve, and batteries can solve different problems on the grid, but their problem was particularly to do with that peak energy demand, 5 to 9 p.m. So this is what the NV Energy CEO said. The hours that NV Energy really get concerned about are about 5 to 9 p.m. because what happens at that point, solar energy has started to ramp off as the sun's going down. And so we've often had to go out to the market, the energy market, and buy energy to meet the demands between 5 and 9 p.m. So this is very common among utilities. You can't always produce the exact amount of power you need, so you can just buy it from your neighboring utilities. But it goes on over the last couple of years. On average, we've paid $250 a unit of energy during those hours. And we look at a project like this battery project, and they can deliver that same energy for closer to $100 an hour. So just to cover those 2 hours of storage, they think they'll see a 15 to 20% reduction in the energy bills of customers by the end of this year. And, you know, another benefit of batteries is they're way quicker to deploy than other more complicated types of energy.
Very quick to deploy, especially if you have a grid connection like an old coal plant. That's only 2 hours. There's 2 hours of storage, and then there's 4 hours, generally speaking, right now.
And you're saving like 15, 20% just for that 2 hours. It's amazing.
From that 4 hour period of 5 to 9 when everyone gets home from work and starts consuming. I don't know why it goes down at 9. Do people go to bed at 9? Some people do.
I certainly do.
You certainly do.
Oh, yeah. I'm out like a light.
You're asleep right now. You've never been awake. Okay, well, that's interesting. That's just one of the many ways. Plus, they stabilize the grid because they can react so quickly to demand increases, and that saves money. Don't ask me how. I'm not a grid expert, but I think, when the grid goes down, they lose equipment, and hardware has to be replaced and other things like that, and people have to go out and fix things. So if you can meet that demand without tripping it with batteries immediately, you don't even use the whole battery. You just respond for a while till something else can kick in. It's pretty cool.
And they can always add more batteries later.
Okay, well, you know what? April batteries. It's been a huge month. We're at the end of April now, and we talk on this podcast for 4 years now about battery innovation being incremental. Sometimes it's more than incremental, Brian. Sometimes it's more than a couple of percentage here or there of something improving. There's some big news this year so far, and a lot of it has come just in April. 1 month. They're essential. Batteries, as we just said, are essential components to the energy transition because they serve as the bridge between renewable energy generation and consumption, because renewable energy is variable, wind is variable, sun goes down, and the batteries help with that, especially in the evenings. That's often where they're used right now. The energy storage systems can store surplus electricity when generation exceeds demand during the day when the sun's shining. You got more solar than the grid needs. You put it into batteries and release it when the demand surpasses generation in the evenings. Here's a stat. In 2016, the energy sector accounted for 50% of the global demand of batteries. So all the batteries that you think about in your laptop, your phones, and everything else, half of those batteries went into grid storage in 2016, which actually surprises me.
Yeah.
And the rest of them went into batteries, because I don't know how much one container of grid storage batteries would be compared to cell phones or whatever, but it would be a lot, I imagine. But by 2023, energy share has risen to above 90% in a market that is 10 times the size as it was in 2016. So now 90% of batteries in the world are going into grid storage. And there's a lot more batteries being made, 10 times as much in the last 8 years. California has installed 10,000 megawatts of battery storage, more than any state or country except for China. Now, we see stories, and we talked about them installing small little battery projects in California. I had no idea that it was quite what it is, because we've talked last week and the week before about all the energy that's, battery was the #1 source of energy for a limited amount of time in the evenings around 8 o'clock when it's deploying. It was the biggest share of the grid.
Yeah, and if you think about the general public, I think they would be shocked to find that grid storage batteries even exist.
I'm mildly shocked, Brian. I'm mildly shocked. So yes, I think people would just look at you funny if you told them. I'll try telling people, but I think no one's going to believe that. And maybe some of our new listeners are a little bit surprised. So battery storage news this month alone, listen to this, advances that have been made or announced are going to accelerate the deploying of renewables in a big way. CATL, that is the world's biggest battery company, they're a Chinese company. They have announced a lithium iron phosphate battery chemistry that would offer, in an electric car, for example, 1,000 kilometers of range. That's about 600 miles. We don't need that. I think you and I, even in this extremely cold climate that we live, don't really understand the need for a 1,000-kilometer car. Some exist, some have been announced with other battery technologies, but it's a lot of battery to carry around when you know you're going to have to go pee at some point on the highway. So you stop for 10 minutes and you charge and you're done. So you have to stop anyway. Why not charge your car? So yeah, they're talking about 1,000-kilometer range for EVs with this new chemistry of batteries, and a guaranteed performance. This is guaranteed for 15 years in storing renewable energy for the grid, which I believe is around double of what they are now. So that, of course, reduces your cost. If the same battery gives you twice the output because it's around for twice the time, your cost per unit of energy stored is lower, and then you deploy more of them. The lower the cost is, the more it makes sense to deploy even more. And then, of course, the price goes down further. So, yeah, and then in cars, these things would be for 1 million miles. 1 million miles, which is 1.6 million kilometers. I mean, what car goes 1 million miles? Your car is going to fall apart before the battery does.
Generally going to fall apart first, yeah.
And if it lasts that long and your car falls apart, say half that, then what do you do with the battery? You don't recycle it. Maybe you put that into energy storage for a while. This is down the road. This is a problem not for now, but for down the road.
Yeah, maybe not quite as simple as the Gogoro thing where you just pull out the battery and stick it in a thing. You would have to reconfigure it in some way, but absolutely used when the car is used up.
There's been examples, because the Nissan Leaf is one of the oldest cars around that's electric, that's sold in any numbers. There's been examples of them using those for storage projects, small ones, experimental ones, but they'll pull the battery out and basically, have it ready to be hooked up into a building that powers things. So also, this is the remarkable thing when we talk about battery developments. These are coming immediately, like right now. They're manufacturing them right now. They're building the machines to manufacture them right now, and then they will be out. This is often we talk about battery things that come out in the lab. It's been proven in the lab, it works, but now we just got to get the production costs down. These CATL, the world's biggest, they're not fooling around. This is huge, and they are doing it very quickly. And this is good news for the world, because this will get rid of fossil fuels very quickly. People don't understand. I know I got pushback from oil bros on Twitter and TikTok. They don't get this. They don't understand the connection between batteries and fossil fuels going away. And I don't know why they love fossil fuels so much, honestly. Why would you love something that makes you sick and pollutes the air? But anyway, it'll take years, before this tech maybe gets into all cars or all energy storage. But, also there could be other better tech coming along that displaces some of this at some point, even before it becomes widely dispersed. It's hard to say. And number two, this is number two now, CATL battery storage for grid, the container. They've got this product now that they're going to mass produce immediately that has zero degradation for 5 years. We talked about this before. Increased energy density by 30%. That is something of a certain size will carry 30% more energy in it than it did before, and a decrease the size of it by 20%. Not only is the energy density gone up, but these containers are actually going to be 1/5 smaller. And all this has happened this month. So it's just crazy. Last summer, CATL unveiled a battery called the Shenzeng that can add up to 400 kilometers of range in a vehicle in 10 minutes of charging, which is perfect for me. I'm getting old, but even as a young man, my bladder wouldn't last more than 3 hours because I'm drinking something caffeinated to drive on the highway. You stop, and by the time you go to the bathroom and get a coffee or a drink, 10 minutes is done. But I can't stretch my legs in less than 10 minutes.
No, and that's even often been the case when I'm doing road trips with my Tesla. The car is often ready before I am.
Even now. So, there won't be any excuses anymore for people not to buy electric cars. So they said a couple months ago, actually, I think, that they're going to reduce the cost of the batteries per kilowatt hour, that's unit of electricity, by 50%. Now, solar has gone down dramatically in price over the years, but it's been steady. It has not fallen 50% in 6 months. So that is an incredible benchmark. A lot of this has to do with the pandemic, sort of demand, keeping, I think prices maybe were artificially level or even a little higher for batteries.
Yeah, it took a while for the supply chain to realize what was going on, and what's going on is an incredible ton of batteries is getting made.
And now the price drop is catching up to that curve. So even though it stayed the same, and this is what often happens with batteries, if it does stay the same 1 year, it drops twice as much the next year. If you look at the charts, the graphs. So also in April, BYD, that is the car maker that is competing with Tesla to be the world's #1 electric car maker right now, and the second biggest battery maker in the world. They not only make cars, they are the second biggest battery maker in the world after CATL, also Chinese company. They launched its next generation storage system. This is for the grid to store renewable energy. It competes on specs with the one I just mentioned from CATL, and even is a little bit better. It beats it. So it's not just a coincidence that CATL has had an innovation. It's just because you're making so much battery. And somebody pointed out that, I think there's like 460,000 STEM graduates in China every year. What is it? Science, technology, engineering, and math. Well, you get to pick for the cream of the crop of all those STEM graduates. And because these are this is the new oil. This is the bigger companies in the world. And they're getting great innovations from them because they have so much. The United States, I worry about your education system. I worry about our education system too in Canada, in our future ability to compete and innovate in the world because China seems to be taking over. And by the way, these BYD grid storage batteries that I mentioned that are actually better, deliveries are all, not manufacturing, deliveries are going to start immediately. Like it's happening now. This podcast has to come out every hour in order to keep up. There's just no way we can keep up once a week. This is not a lab announcement press release. This is real world lightning innovation and scaling up. China will add this year in battery grid storage what the rest of the world already has in history, plus what the rest of the world is going to add this year. That's what China is going to add. So when that happens, that speeds the closing of Chinese coal plants, which are still a problem. So renewables will wipe them out economically, and they will operate less, and then they will close down. And that's good. And plus, when you start manufacturing batteries for the Chinese market on such a huge scale, it brings the prices down. The larger you manufacture, the cheaper it is. CATL is shooting for 2028 with the release of solid-state batteries. This is the elusive solid-state battery that we talked about for years. That has been promised. Toyota's even promising one by 2028. This is the tough one because it's expensive to manufacture and they don't quite have all the problems solved with it, but I just want to go over why solid-state batteries are desirable, okay? So when you remove the liquid electrolyte in the batteries to have a solid-state battery, this reduces the fire risk, so they're much safer. And unlike conventional lithium batteries that charge slowly from 80% to full, so when you're on a highway in an electric car, you only charge to 80% because it can take, the same amount of time to get there as it is from 80 to 100%. It slows down. There's reasons for that, which I could explain, but I'll leave that for another show. And solid-state batteries, though, I guess they charge fully all the way and faster, so that's a good thing. Solid-state batteries are also more energy dense. There's more energy in the same package, making them lighter and smaller than lithium-ion batteries. This could lead to lighter, smaller electric cars or extend their range without increasing size and weight, or those Gogoro scooters could go maybe 60 kilometers instead of 40 or whatever it is. And they could potentially make electric aircraft more feasible, which is important as well. But April 2024, Brian, a huge moment in history for batteries and the clean, renewable transition.
That is amazing. All right, it is time to dip into the mailbag. All right, so, hey, Brian and James, I'm just listening to your most recent episode, and you mentioned how you saw 2 Chevy Bolts drive by in the background of a report in Montreal about rising gas prices, and how you said they are rare to see. While you are certainly correct that Teslas are by far the most common EVs, I think you would be blown away at how many EVs are starting to appear on the roads of Montreal. You see a good amount of Bolts as well as Konas, Souls, Ioniq 5s, Ioniq 6s, Mach-E's, Neros, Polestars, F-150 Lightnings, EV6s, electric BMWs, BZ4Xs, Sorteras, Taycans, C40s, e-trons, Leafs, Arias, and even the occasional MX-30 Mazda.
The rarest of
only
EVs.
made a handful of those. You'd be blown away coming from right-wing EV hater country to left-wing electrified Quebec. By the way, you are still arguably my favorite podcast of the 20 or so that I cycle through weekly as I do chores and cook in stuff. All the best from Mitchell. So yeah, we wondered, why doesn't everybody in Quebec drive an EV? Because they've had really good incentives for years. And well, I guess Mitchell is telling us that, they kind of do.
Well, Mitchell, I knew that because I was aware and jealous of the incentives that Quebec had. Very large incentives for new EVs. And when I bought my Nissan Leaf, my 5-year-old Leaf, I imported it from south of Montreal. And it's because I knew, while looking just at Auto Trader nationally, that there was a lot of lower priced EVs. It was much lower than BC, where they had a premium price on them, because the incentives were even better in Quebec. And they had a used incentive for dealers. I think it was $4,000 to import an EV, and that mine was imported from the States, from New York State into Quebec. And that's where I bought it. But that program ended, and I saw them all disappearing from Auto Trader, and it was anxious. I got one of the last ones that was cheap, one of the base models.
So even though you had to ship it in from Quebec, it was still the cheapest way to get a Nissan Leaf.
Yeah. And if it was working properly, if my heater was working and I kept up with the suspension, I think I could sell it for what I paid for it. Because they're really expensive now, especially here where you don't have as many options around for used vehicles, especially used EVs. So, lower priced ones. So yeah, I was happy. I'm still happy driving that car. And I still remember the day it came in. I hired a sort of a gig worker transportation, and they took out a motorcycle, and then my car came out. It didn't start. There was no noise. It just sort of came out. And I put it in my driveway quite happily. It was quite a day to have your first EV. Thank you for writing the letter, Mitchell. We'd like to hear from you, our listeners. It's one of the favorite parts of the show. Contact us by email, cleanenergyshow@gmail.com. You can also leave us a voicemail online. We love that. Speakpipe.com/cleanenergyshow. And our podcast runs on support from our listeners. You can donate one time or on a monthly basis using the PayPal link in your show notes.
All right, from Electric, the U.S. has a plan to upgrade 100,000 miles of transmission lines in just 5 years. So, as we know, not only do we have to switch to clean energy, but the world is just going to need a lot more electricity as people start driving electric cars. So, grids are going to have to make substantial upgrades. And so the U.S. is trying to do this. This is, part of the Inflation Reduction Act, and it is, could be called the Green New Deal. That would have been a better term perhaps than the Inflation Reduction Act. But, the original New Deal in the U.S. spent a ton of money on infrastructure, and there's going to need to be a similar amount of spending on infrastructure to get this stuff going. So they're going to use basically upgrades for some of it. They're basically the transmission lines can be upgraded to just carry more electricity, and they're also going to just make more power lines. For instance, there's going to be a 2 gigawatt transmission line from Idaho to Nevada. That's one of the new projects. That one's part of the bipartisan infrastructure law. The rest of it, like I said, grid enhancing technologies is what they call it. It's the most inexpensive way to it's, a thicker wire, I guess, to...
they call that, oh God, what is it called? It's not rewiring, but it's something where they replace the wires and there's new technology in wires where they're thicker. They can carry up to 3 times what the old wire could. But you have all this land. This is the hard part when you want to build new transmission is the land. You have to, get environmental approvals and purchase the land or lease the land and put the transmission towers up. But if they can use the same towers and put up 3 times the transmission, that's exciting. I mean, it does cost a significant amount of money, but it's less and faster. That's the important part. It's faster. And there's other ways too, like the current transmission lines. It's based on heat, where they have a peak heat temperature. But if you put these new sensors that one company has on them, they're fairly expensive, but it pays off quite well. You can, just make sure it doesn't get beyond that temperature. And generally speaking, you're pumping more power through it than you were before, significantly more. So, we say the transmission is a big bottleneck, right? But there's great ways of improving that before we build new transmission.
Yeah, and the grid is getting smarter, and that's one of the ways. We didn't have these kinds of software things. AI can be used to monitor the lines, as you say, with sensors to make sure everything's going. So this is from the Biden administration. There is the Grid Resilience and Innovation Partnership Program. That's the GRIP program. And the U.S. Department of Energy has also simplified the environmental review process for transmission line upgrades. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago in terms of geothermal energy projects. They're trying to streamline the permitting process. All of this has to become easier and quicker to do because all of this has to happen quickly.
Same with solar on rooftops. That's a major thing advantage that Australia has. They've gotten rid of the red tape and the permitting time, and if you can get rid of that, it makes it a lot more economical for companies to do that. So very interesting stuff. And 4 years ago when we started the podcast, I knew nothing about grids. I know slightly more now, but I feel like it's something we have to learn about and discuss on the show. And and speaking of grids, the Biden coal regulations, this is from Bloomberg. The administration in the United States is taking strong steps to reduce pollution from the U.S. electricity sector, focusing on carbon dioxide emissions from coal plants. Coal plants are just 20% of the power mix right now in the United States, but it's so dirty, it's still more than half of the power sector in the United States CO2 emissions just from coal. That's why we got to get rid of them. The new Biden power sector rules say that coal-fired power plants need to capture all of their CO2 by 2032 or close by 2039. We talked about, carbon capture. It's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. Not all of it. I mean, that's not going to happen.
And pretending that carbon capture can work ends up just delaying all of these things and keeping the coal plants open longer.
New gas-fired plants, that's natural gas that often replaces coal plants that are closed, they must also meet strict emission reductions. These new rules are part of a larger push towards using renewable energy sources like wind and solar, especially as demand on the power sector increases due to advancements in technology such as artificial intelligence, which we talked about a lot, and the growth of electric vehicles charging. For example, the energy use by U.S. data centers is expected to triple by the end of the decade, and this initiative is one of President Joe Biden's major efforts to combat climate change. It builds on previous policies targeting emissions from cars, trucks, and oil operations. And since power plants are a major source of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, cutting these emissions is crucial for meeting international climate commitments like the Paris Climate Agreement. And this new set of rules is likely to accelerate the closure of many coal plants. I can see it closing them all. I think they're going to close them all anyway, Brian, because you can't compete with renewables. And when there's a battery breakthrough, that even makes it a bigger dagger in the side of fossil fuels.
Yeah, it's already becoming not economically viable to run these coal plants, and they can't, spit out the electricity as fast as, say, battery storage can. But yeah, there's also reports here from Power Magazine that the G7 countries are in talks to put 2035 as an end date for coal-fired generation. So it sounds like this is not finalized or anything, but the G7, this is US, Canada, UK, France, Germany, Japan, and Italy. For Canada, this is a no-brainer. We only have 2 provinces, I think, that burn coal.
And we were
anyway,
targeting 2030, and, we were supposed to do it by 2030, and our Petro province, Saskatchewan, Canada, is not willing to do that. They're backing away.
It's a no-brainer for Canada to commit to because our grid is already very low carbon. It's just a couple of things that have to close. But yeah, 2035. But yeah, it's going to happen anyway because it's too expensive to run these coal plants anyway.
Yeah, it is.
Big news here from Honda. This is, again, news from Canada, where James and I are, but a massive, massive investment in EV batteries and vehicles here in Canada. This is a $15 billion announcement from Honda and the Ontario government, the Canadian government. Both of those governments are going to pitch in a few $1 billion of this massive $15 billion project. So Honda has been one of those laggards when it comes to electric vehicles. Since this isn't going to start pumping out EVs until 2028, that still makes them laggards, really. I guess their Honda Prologue is just starting to come out. They do have an EV. I haven't really learned too much about that one.
We'll see how many of them they make, though, and how they're priced. Toyota certainly botched their rollout of the BZ4X.
Yeah. But I was watching the Stanley Cup playoffs, and Honda had some advertising on the boards for their Honda Prologue EV. So,
well, they're just advertising that they're an advanced company, and we shouldn't discard them as being from the past, which they unfortunately are. And I'm a fan of Honda and Toyota, but they have not agreed to go forward with the transition that we know is coming. We know that EVs are better vehicles from our own experience.
Yeah, so this is going to be basically 4 giant factories. So there's going to be an EV manufacturing plant in Alliston. So this is going to pump out 240,000 EVs a year. That's 2028. There's going to be a battery manufacturing plant that will do 36 gigawatts of batteries a year. They're going to have a cathode active material and precursor cathode active material factory. And this is a joint venture with POSCO Chemicals, which is a Korean company. They haven't said where that's going to happen. And then the 4th is a separator factory, whatever that is, but the separator part of a battery, I guess. And that's a joint venture.
Yeah. So there's different aspects to the manufacturing of batteries. So they haven't said where they're going to do this, but the government has put in a crap load of money, and honestly, I'm a little nervous about it. I'm not sure that it's going to pay off. They won't be in power when this happens in 2028, but we'll see what happens. Like it could be a bit of a boondoggle if Honda doesn't actually go through with it, or if Honda doesn't, actually, if they're out of business, or if they're not competing, if Chinese companies have taken over the auto market by then. That's a long ways away. 4 years is a long ways away. In this, what we talk about on the show, it's a long ways away.
Yeah. No, but it is a huge investment by government. But, that's kind of what's happening right now in the U.S. and Canada, massive government investment to help spur this thing along. So, yeah, the separator factory is a joint venture with a Japanese company. So, yeah, 4 big factories and $15 billion.
A lot of money, and I'd like to be a part of the energy transition, including the electrification of transportation. But it can be scary at times because these are big numbers, and who knows how it's going to play out. It's time for the lightning round.
The lightning round is a fast-paced look at the latest headlines in climate, clean energy, and transportation.
Battery recycling, Brian, drops the number of miles an EV has to drive to break even with ICE vehicles, environmentally speaking, that is gas and diesel cars, from 25,000 miles to 15,000 miles, or about 24,000 kilometers. That's about what some people drive in a year. The CO2 break-even point for EVs compared to ICE just dropped when you factor in recycling. So that's pretty cool. That means that EVs are even more environmental than we initially thought, because we weren't factoring in.
A carbon footprint to EVs, but it's basically 1 year compared to forever for a gas car.
So that's about a 40% reduction in the miles driven to get to that break-even point. Okay, here's a stat for you. Fires per 100,000 vehicles sold in the United States. This is the number of fires per 100,000 vehicles. EVs, 25. Petrol and diesel vehicles, gas and diesel vehicles, 1,530. My math isn't so good, but that's a lot. There's a big difference. Big difference there.
People get worried about battery fires in cars because...
Front page news nationally.
Yeah. But yeah, my last road trip down to Colorado saw one car burning at the side of the road. Saw a car burning at the side of the road once on the freeway in LA. It's a surprisingly common thing.
I've seen it picking up my kids at school. I don't know why, but it happens. China launches the world's largest electric container ship. That is a container ship, which you see, when you think of ships, shipping containers through the Suez Canal and places like that. This is going to be electric, and it is not going very far. It's only 100, I don't know. It's a short distance between ports in China, but they're slashing 8,600 pounds of emissions per 100 nautical miles. This is from the Tech Times if you want to read more about it. Manufactured by the state-owned China Ocean Shipping Group, or COSCO. COSCO, the shipping container vessels you see on trains and everywhere else all the time. The vessel is now operating on a regular service route between Shanghai and Nanjing. California now has one EV fast charging station for every 5 gas stations. Now, we talk about charging stations at home, at restaurants, shopping malls. Often they're not fast, but the fast ones that you need on the highway, or if you live in an apartment and you want to gas up once a week, fuel up once a week, that's what they have. So yeah, and most charging is done at home, so you don't really need as many. I mean, you're always saying that on the show. So that's actually a pretty decent ratio, as long as you fill in what we call charging deserts, the little areas on the map that don't have them, and as long as they're frequent enough in all places, that's really good.
Yeah, you probably need a little more than 1-to-5 ratio, but yeah, they're getting close in California.
It's time for a CS Fast Fact. Since 2010, battery costs have fallen by more than 90%, offering opportunities to cut emissions in road transportation and electricity. But in 2023, electric car sales rose to almost 14 million. And battery storage deployment in the power sector has more than doubled. So it's going fast. The U.S. grid capacity factors in 2023, I find this interesting, so I'm going to tell you. The capacity factor for a power generation station is you have what the maximum is. I've got solar panels on my roof. They're maximum rated at 3.3 kilowatts. But are they always putting that out? No. Nighttime, no. Mornings, evenings, no. That's the peak at the middle of the day. Even nuclear plants and coal plants, they don't run at 100%. They run at a certain percent because you have downtime and different things like that. So in the 2023 last year, coal in the United States on the electricity grid of the United States was 42%, which is...
Yes. So if all the coal plants ran at maximum capacity, it could supply 42% of the country's electricity needs.
No.
No?
No.
Damn it.
You misunderstood me. So maybe I should clarify more for the listeners. This is the capacity of each coal plant as an average of what they can do. So a coal plant might be rated for X number, like 1 gigawatt, let's say, similar to a nuclear reactor. A big coal plant might be 1 gigawatt. Well, this is running at 42% on average. That's what coal plants were doing on average. And it's important. You see that falling down in China. The coal was like at 60, 70, and now it's falling down to like 50, and it's continuing to fall. The capacity factor, this is what they're generating because they don't need it. So that's kind of what's going on in the States too, is that the coal is falling. Natural gas was at 40%. There's a lot of downtime. We had power outages just a couple of weeks ago in Alberta because of 3 natural gas plants tripping offline and having problems and needing fixing. Solar is generally 23%, and that's basically what solar is no matter what. There's no downtime for solar. It doesn't have to be repaired and go offline, or a couple of panels might be, but generally speaking, solar is at 23%. So that's a factor that stays the same, as is wind. Wind is 34% of its maximum capacity. So basically wind is blowing decently enough 34% of the time. Yeah, and also a little bit of wind is not like a lot of wind. Nuclear is actually pretty good at 93%, so 90% is often what is quoted. So 93 is pretty good for nuclear. Hydro is actually 34%, which surprised me because you always think of hydro dams running all the time because water flows all the time. You don't stop flowing water.
And I guess they probably do run all the time, but they just regulate how much of the time they're running so they don't run out of water, amongst other things.
Geothermal was at 70% of its maximum capacity. Just thought that was interesting, and it's something that I'm learning along with our listeners. From PV Magazine, the DNV forecasts that solar energy in China will account for 38% of the country's electricity production by 2050. Compared to, it's only 5%. You think of all the solar they deployed in China, it's only 5%, but it's going to multiply that by quite a few times still. It's time for another CES Fast Fact. China, again with the China. China currently has the capacity to produce some 40 million vehicles, electric vehicles a year, though it sells only around 22 million. So it has capacity to sell almost twice as much as they do. Like the capacity is there because, I don't know, China.
And they would love to sell them in North America, but that's going to be a slow road.
The context here is that the United States auto market is around 15 million. And yeah, so that's where it is. So if we were to buy Chinese cars, they would sell them to us, basically is what that stat tells me. Germany is adding 3.7 gigawatts of solar capacity. When did they do that, Brian? So far this year, this early year of 2024, wow. That's what they've added in solar capacity, basically 3.7 nuclear reactors worth. But again, it's operating around 23% of that. And that's a lot. It's just telling you that's a lot of solar, okay? And they already had a lot of solar, and they added that much more just in the last couple of months or so. In a historic agreement, the G7 has agreed to phase out coal in the first half of the 2030s, which we mentioned earlier on the show. World's first hydrogen station for commercial trucks opens. Is it too late? Ask sustainable website. Electric? I don't know. But I think whenever we have battery innovation, see, long-range trucking is sort of on the cusp. Will it work? Will it not work? Well, when a battery improvement comes along, it works. So, and it's just easier to put up a charging station, even a megawatt charging station, than it is to deploy hydrogen, which is inefficient because it takes energy to make hydrogen. It takes the renewable energy to make the hydrogen, which you could be just putting into the battery of a truck. India allocated 1.5 gigawatts of solar at at 3 cents a kilowatt, which is really, really cheap. Because, Brian, nothing can compete with 3 cents a kilowatt.
Yeah. That's about the lowest price you can get electricity for right now.
We pay retail about 15, 16 cents, but, you know, that's really cheap. Of course, it's India, good solar potential. And finally this week, this is a tweet of the week. This is from John Taylor, and it's a short one, but I'm just going to point it out. Seriously, you're going to wake up one morning in the 2050s in a home warmed by your wind-powered heat pump, open the dividend from your solar farm share, ride to work in an electric bus passing fields of agroforestry brimming with wildlife, and wonder, what was all the fuss about? I think that's
Very
the
nice
truth.
way.
I think that the people, the oil bros who are poo-pooing solar and wind and EVs, they're going to say, I didn't do that. I never said anything about EVs. When everyone's driving an EV 10, 15 years from now, they're going to forget that they ever spent half their life on Twitter poo-pooing it all.
Yes, and what they're complaining about now, yeah, they'll just be shopping for an EV in a few years from now anyway. All right, that is our show for this week. You can contact us at cleanenergyshow@gmail.com. Around social media, we are Clean Energy Pod, and we have videos of our show on TikTok and YouTube, including special content that is not featured on the podcast.
Rate and review us on Apple or wherever you're listening to our show, whatever app you're using. If you could rate and review us, helps us. And why wouldn't you want to help us? If you're new to the show, welcome. Thanks for coming. We have a great time doing this every week, but remember to subscribe on your podcast app, because that way you'll get the new episodes downloaded, and we release them every week, although we could release them every hour if we had the robotic energy to do so. There's just that much going on, and I can't wait to do it again next week, Brian.
Yeah, I'll see you next week.
The Clean Energy Show.